So welcome all to this new reading group session organized by ContinualAI. My name is Vincent Solomon again. For this session, I'm going to be the moderator. And now we have our invited speaker, Arijit, Arijit Patra from Oxford University, who is going to present the paper, Learn More to Get Less Cues from the Human Brain. So thank you, Arijit, for being here today, and welcome all. Arijit, the stage is yours.
Hi, Vincenzo. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very sorry to everyone for the confusion regarding the time zone issues. So anyway, now that we are, so I would like to talk a little more about our recent publication in ACCV. This is titled "Learn More, Forget Less: Cues from the Human Brain." And both of us at the time of writing the paper were affiliated to the Department of Engineering Science at Oxford, and I have since graduated and I presently work with AstraZeneca in Cambridge, and Tapabrata is affiliated with the Nuffield Department of Medicine at the University of Oxford. So yes, thanks for once again. So moving on, the most important idea about this paper is that we wanted to take some inspiration from how humans, or more generally mammals, manage to learn relevant information so efficiently and remember the more interesting bits of information over extended time, and all of that happens without any significant amount of deterioration for most cases. And so in terms of the actual learning process, the whole idea of learning that happens in mammals or in humans, that has been a topic of interest in cognitive neuropsychology for a few decades now, mostly motivated by concerns around memory loss and around the whole quest of creating more efficient learning regimes in pedagogy and so on. So there is a rich body of literature in that domain, and to an extent, a lot of this idea about catastrophic forgetting or the role of continual learning or incremental learning in the 90s, when there was not so much of a prominence of deep learning, was actually expounded by individuals who were preeminent researchers in cognitive neuropsychology, such as French and McCulloch and so on. So in fact, the first ever studies of neural networks and catastrophic forgetting in neural networks was actually motivated by concerns in that direction, when neural networks are also used for modeling workflows in the human brain. So it's only fair that such inspirations come back when we are reinventing a lot of the original research in the deep learning era. So, and this is sort of one more immediate inspiration for this paper is from FearNet. Really, FearNet was one of the you know pioneering papers in recent years, which actually tried to contextualize catastrophic forgetting in the deep learning system, and they drew inspirations from fear conditioning experiments in the human brain. So differently from them, we do not really consider fear conditioning as a motivating factor here. Instead, we actually look into the long-term potentiation that happens in the brain. So essentially, we are talking about lifelong learning approaches inspired by mammalian brains and long-term potentiation in the brain. And we are essentially mimicking the complementary learning systems theories, which essentially talks about dual memory consolidation approaches. And we sort of mimic that using a dual generative replay process. So overall, the way we implement it is that we treat the hippocampus inspired module as our immediate classifier, as our decision maker of on terms of arrival of new information, and also something that would be used in inference. This is consistent with the role of the hippocampus as the arbiter of arriving information, and also directing how to consolidate memory out of information that comes into either short-term or working memory, and then directing it to the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex essentially serves to encode sort of like working to short-term memory over a few seconds to a few weeks time, and really long-lasting memories are then aggregated over a few weeks to years into the neocortex. The neocortex in the brain is the repository of the stable memory formation. So overall, the hippocampus module is then implemented as a probabilistic classifier. This is to keep it consistent with other brain-inspired works that have been seen in recent years. And the regularization that happens in incremental stages is essentially using generated representations from the prefrontal cortex or the NCT. Here, when we talk about regularization, we are really talking about essentially providing snapshots of one-dimensional vectorized representations that are generated in those modules as sort of representative of past learning. So essentially these are interspersed between different training batches, and that's why you do not really see these being fed into the convolutional part of the operation. And the hippocampus then is used for the final inference, where the inference only requires you to have the image level input, and the other input strands are frozen. Now the we talk about modeling in two stages here. We talk about an intermediate consolidation and a long-term consolidation. The intermediate consolidation, sort of like inspired by the working memory consolidation that we see in brains, is actually performed in this generative module that is inspired by the prefrontal cortex. Now, when you talk about the mimicking the role of the PFC or the prefrontal cortex, we are fundamentally talking about the balance between the plasticity and the stability that you usually encounter even in the mammalian brain system. The idea being that if a particular module or a particular repository of memories is particularly plastic, then it's easy to override the information that is already resident there. And if it is particularly stable, then it is very hard for it to learn new things and to write new information. So playing this balance between plasticity and stability also has been a challenge for continual learning systems, that how do you ensure to what extent some parameters are to be plastic and to what extent some parameters are to be stable. And different approaches have been tried, such as parameter importance based scoring and assigning sort of higher penalties for more important parameters in terms of synaptic intelligence and so on. What we are doing here is something very simple. We say that we are implementing an autoencoder based generative model. So if we are to essentially penalize any kind of new learning very heavily, we would just have a very strong regularization term, a very strong reconstruction term. So if we were to actually have a relatively plastic one, we would just control the number of terms that we have in the reconstruction stages. So essentially we want to keep plasticity to a fair amount in the prefrontal cortex. So we have a late stage L2 reconstruction error. And this PFC over a sequence of different stages is meant to encode representations into the long-term repository of the NCT. Now, moving on to the Neocortex inspired module, this is where we are talking about really stable consolidation. Now, similar to the analogous area in the brain, the neocortex is the repository of long lasting information of very stable encodings. So when we are talking about stable consolidation into the NCT, we need to ensure that information in the NCT is not easily overwritten. As a result, we want to have sort of a fairly strong intermediate regularization in terms of the encoder and the decoder arms. This is with the idea that the decoder arm is primarily concerned with actually retaining or actually generating the representation that would be used, and whereas the encoder arm essentially has immediate access to the incoming information. So an attempt to actually override the or to control the amount to which the parameters in the encoder side are sort of modified by the new information, it is pertinent that we try to minimize that by showing them a snapshot of the previously seen information which is still available at the decoder stage, while we are trying to train the whole encoder decoder system with this new information, which is why this kind of an intermediate regularization ends up making sense in terms of promoting stability to a higher degree. Controlling the number of stages essentially allows us to tune the amount of plasticity we want to impose on the overall stable landscape. So overall, this system then ends up working as sort of a feedback loop where we are talking about arriving new information in a few epochs, then over sequences of subsets of epochs, we actually encode things into the PFC, and over other subsets of epochs that subsequently follow, we are also in tandem incorporating information from the PFC, using those representations to be written onto the NCT, which is supposed to retain information for an extended amount of time. And eventually, at the time of the regularization over incremental tasks in the hippocampus, representations from both the PFC and the NCT are used as snapshots. So these representations that you would see essentially would be an aggregation of all the different classes that have been seen so far. In a way, that is an inefficiency of the process, I would say. So I mean, that can in future work be addressed through, say, some kind of a weightage mechanism on the classes that as they are written and as the representations are written onto the PFC, and also at the time of actually writing those onto the NCT. However, for now, in the NeoNet, if we talk about the performance, we do see a marked improvement, and at least for these, the C400 in the Caltech 256 and Cub 200 on the different incremental schedules, what we do observe is that the long-range dependencies are actually modeled better by the dual generative replay approach. Like particularly when we talk about things like two-class increments, we are really talking about a large number of incremental stages, because we are essentially taking a baseline, let's say at 50 classes for C400, and if we do a two-class increment after that, that's a really 25 incremental stages. So in these long-range stages, we do see a superior performance. And at this time, even if we talk about comparing with more relevant approaches like FearNet or others, which are other brain-inspired approaches, we do see improvements over them, and we ascribe it to the inclusion of a really stable Neocortex module. So essentially, incorporation of a separate island of stability, so to speak, is seen to improve this long-ranging dependency based on this dual generative replay approach. So, and we did also some ablation studies in this regard, particularly with respect to the, fine tuning or tuning the stability versus plasticity approach by controlling the amount of KL regularization, KL divergence regularization that we did in the NCT. Also control the number of base classes. I mean, more the base classes, the better, because the initial representations are really stable then. And also the whole idea of to what extent we are actually gonna wait till we actually write information into the NCT from the PFC. So all of these were parts of the ablation and as described in detail in the paper. So essentially, we did a lot of these experiments and presented these ablations and observed primarily
Arijit,
long-range dependency. So this is what we have so far. And I'm happy to take any more questions. And with the conclusion being that we are essentially presenting a new brain-inspired architecture for continual learning, and mostly relying on very recent advances in neuroscience. So purely from a continual learning standpoint, I would say the key takeaway is that having a dual generative model and varying the amount of plasticity and stability essentially improves the ability to retain information for a long range incremental task addition. And that is what I would say is the key takeaway for this kind of an approach. Thank you.
You're welcome, Arijit. That was fast. So we have a question from Prakhar.
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, Arijit, can you go back to the main slide, the one which had an overview of the entire network model?
Yes.
Yeah, can you explain your work in with this slide a bit, because you're referring everything to as hippocampus and Neocortex wave, which kind of makes it hard for people like me who come from computer science to understand a bit. Can you give a general understanding here?
Right. So when you say a general understanding, would you want something in terms of how these things roughly work in a neuroscience perspective?
Yeah. No, in a general perspective, not just a neuroscience perspective.
Okay. I mean, I don't understand what a general perspective would be apart from that, but let's say we do it this way. What we are essentially doing from, I'll nevertheless say from a, let's say the way we understood it while implementing it. Essentially, the hippocampus is the arbiter of incoming information as you receive your stimuli, and this is where to actually consolidate the information either as short-term memory or working memory or long-term memory is sort of decided. Now, the hippocampus essentially also directs, sort of the executive function of the brain, like to understand what actions to take, and the relevant modules are then directed to. Purely from the memory consolidation standpoint, if you did not have the hippocampus, it has been observed in practice and for patients that you tend to have anterograde amnesia, which is essentially not having short-term memory or having very diminished short-term memory. So what happens is that after the short-term memory, you have something known as working memory. So from the working memory to the short-term memory, this kind of a consolidation happens in the prefrontal cortex. Now, the region of the prefrontal cortex, it has all of the information that you need for functioning in a relatively short time, from a few seconds to a few weeks. And really stable memories, things that are really have really strong signals in the brain or are really relevant as decided due to subsequent encounters with the same kind of stimuli or due to some very strong influence of that kind of information, is encoded in the neocortex, which is supposed to be a really stable repository of different memories and different information. Now, from this kind of a dual generative model perspective, we decide that the hippocampus, driven by its role of actually deciding what kind of information is to be encoded as a short-term to working memory, and also identifying to what extent different actions can immediately be acted upon, deserves to be modeled as a probabilistic classifier. So we do the classification stage in the hippocampus, or this network that we call the hippocampus, based on the analogous function we see in the brain. Now we take out the fully connected representation that we see at FC512 and decide that this can then be used to train an autoencoder that is supposed to mimic the PFC. Why does it mimic the PFC? Because the PFC is a repository of short-term memory. As a result, it is supposed to be a relatively plastic module and not a very stable module as compared to the Neocortex. And hence we just try to do that using a relatively less extent of regularization. As we see, there is only one L2 term there. And we then move on to the NCT, which is supposed to be the more stable repository of memories. And we achieve such kind of a mimicking of that kind of a stability using a larger number of regularization stages. So that is essentially how we go about implementing this. And when we have to do a rehearsal, we get representations from both of them and use it to as snapshots during the training of the hippocampus. Note that the training is not done in tandem, as in this is not an end-to-end process. So the parts do not necessarily work all at the same time.
Okay. So when does the rehearsal take place then?
So the rehearsal takes place when you are doing incremental additions of new classes. So essentially, the first time we are actually encoding information is after all the base classes are learned. So and then you sort of train both of the other generative modules. You extract the representations that you use in rehearsal during every increment when new incremental classes are added. And now we have some predefined schedules which we talk about in detail in the paper, when we actually also do online sort of encoding into the both of these modules. So essentially, when you have, say, base classes and plus a few more increments, and then you want to show that information to the PFC and the NCT, we do sort of a fine tuning of the PFC and the NCT modules at that stage. And that also happens over different stages. And anyway, that is independent of the actual rehearsal being done for the hippocampus module itself. And that is done every time there is a new incremental set of classes being added. It could be in 2 class, 5 class, or 10 class increments.
Okay, so basically you basically use all the vectors for all the instances in your pseudo rehearsal?
The vectors that we end up using essentially end up being sort of, the overall averages. Average is a wrong word here, but sort of an aggregated representation for all the classes seen so far. The reason that happens is that we are generating vectors overall from these two modules only, and these two modules are not really class specific. So they are at any given point of time a product of all the classes that have been seen so far.
Yes, I mean like this FC512. Do you save those vectors for each and every instance that the model sees, the hippocampus model sees? And then
we do not save them, or we do not really use them to fine tune the PFC or the NCT after every single instance. Instead, like we do it, say for example, we had the 50 base classes that were learned. So we do it for after that whole session is done. So let's say 50 plus 2 classes are incremented, and then we want to do that, then we do it after the 52 classes. So we do it on that basis. So we do not do it on a per class or a per instance basis.
No, I mean like like for every instance of the image which goes through the hippocampus module, so you save fully connected layer which of 512 vector size, and basically use those instances to generate pseudo rehearsal instances. Is that correct?
No. We do not do that for every single instance. We do it. So the one place where we would be saving the FC512 is that once we are done with the whole 50 class training, we save the FC512, and we do that at that point only through a sort of representative examples that we have seen for each of the classes, and sort of like average it. So we do not do it for every single instance. So that is what is saved. Now, when that is done, so we are sort of training the PFC and the NCT that way. So essentially, I think what you're asking is that whether or not after all these 50 classes are added, if I take every single image and then try to average the FC512, but no, that is not something we do, purely because of computational limitations that we have. We actually take sort of in my case, I tried with different, how many images I would take for each classes. I tried with 1 image, and then I tried with 2, and then I tried with 5. So in the final experiments, it is 5 image per class that I have seen so far. I compute the FC512s and just take an average on that, and that is what I save.
Okay, and are those like 5 images per class specific to some heuristic, or are they chosen at random?
They're chosen randomly. I mean, we just need sort of some kind of representation per class and just want to average it. Normally, a better way to do that would be to choose either a very, representative examples. Like representative could be in terms of if there is a lot of intra-class variation, you choose examples relevant to each of those variations, or choose say 5 most difficult classes or the 5 most confident in exemplars or something like that. But in this case, it was done randomly because we are averaging after that anyway. So the effect, if any, of choosing particularly good exemplars would be really minimal on the representation.
Oh, okay. So some people would argue that this is not exactly a true incremental learning setup. And even though humans are never basically see any of the same image or data instance before, we do not actually have catastrophic forgetting or catastrophic indifference. We have gradual forgetting, irrespective of the fact that we see the same image or data or view again. So if this would have been without the pseudo-rehearsal process, how will it be possible to have similar kind of model?
Well, I mean, I would disagree with the fact that humans do not, absolutely forget anything, or, are able to make all decisions without any particular, information available about such decision. The whole idea that you do have a PFC and a prefrontal cortex and a neocortex module that informs the hippocampus on how to act on a stimuli is sort of goes against that. So we almost always do have some associated information in that regard. So to that extent, if you the only fair comparison there would be that if you had absolutely novel information that is available to a human brain and decision is made without absolutely any prior understanding of it, which is when there is no question of an incremental or a learning or even a forgetting, because that's the first time we see that. Regarding the question of gradual forgetting, when you talk about forgetting itself, then so how would we then do that? Like we do not forget as such every time we learn something new, but we do observe that phenomenon in neural networks. So the only hypothesis is that or one of the hypotheses is that humans don't forget when they see something new is because they have a really strong representation of what they learned originally, and so that is erased only gradually. So in this case, in fact, what you're saying is that we should have a very strong long-ranging dependency in terms of not forgetting. So that is something we actually observe if you look at the curves that we see for those 2 class increments. So actually having a balanced stability and plasticity that we do here, which is closer to the brain, sort of actually tries to mimic that situation, and we actually do observe a improved long range performance in that regard. So sort of like a gradual forgetting is observed when you add a lot of different classes like in relatively small increments. So it does simulate that to some degree. So I would not say that this is not a true incremental learning situation, because we are at the end of the day here, we are not really saving any of the original instances. We are relying on representations that we learn from parts of the same mechanism. This is similar to what the brain does as well. I mean, the hippocampus alone would not function without the neocortex or the prefrontal cortex or a lot of other parts. So I think that it's not the best representation. By no means nobody says that this is a absolute representation of the brain or even solves the catastrophic forgetting problem. But I think this is a relevant way to explore this question.
Good, thank you.
Right, so I have a question, Arijit. So you can go back to the general architecture, let's say, image. So from what I see here, I mean, I understand the biological motivation and assumptions that you're making when doing this work. But if you see from this slide, the PFC and NCT architectures, they look quite similar. And do you have some, evidence apart from the biological motivation, that would point to the needs of two different architectures that are kind of solving the same problem, apparently computational. Because as you can see, they are modeling. I mean, they're just trying to learn let's say a latent representation of a stimuli, and then they're trying to reproduce it back, right? And I understand that these may be due to different time scales that you want to cover. But I mean, I wanted to understand if you tried first with just one of these generative, let's say, models instead of two.
Well, I mean, the whole reason for having two of these modules, which, as you said, like purely in terms of the kind of architectures they employ are very similar, is to be able to separate out the stability and the plasticity brackets, and also allow this kind of separating the temporal consolidation that we do. That's the whole motivation there. So, which is why we did not really try with using only one model. So we wanted to very explicitly separate out a stable module from a plastic module, once again shaped by that biological inspiration, so to speak. And so we did not try using a single generative module to see where it goes. Talk about papers like FearNet, they do employ, I mean, they employ multiple modules as well, but from a very different perspective, like because they talk about their motivation being fear consolidation based process. So in fear consolidation, a lot of the executive function is overtaken by the basolateral amygdala or the BLA, which is why they have a BLA module, and they operate solely using the prefrontal cortex as a generative component. Because in fear consolidation, the circuitry, or the fear circuitry as they call it, is between the hippocampus, the basolateral amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, and the BLA decides where to send information to, so the neocortex isn't really involved. So that is why we do have some differences between this and what they did in FearNet. So no, we did not have any motivation to try a single generative model.
Yeah, because it would be nice to see that these let's say additional mechanism that is somehow letting the network be more plastic when learning new things, because you have space for being plastic and a space for consolidating things that actually matters, from a practical perspective. That would be very nice to see, because I haven't seen like
that would sort of amount to comparing it to standard generative replay methods, as in
we
exactly. have, I think, past work. Like I believe like there are these papers that used autoencoder based replay, and there was deep generative replay by Shin et al. I believe they used a GAN. So it would be similar to comparing with those pieces in literature, essentially.
Right, and then another question would be, did you find like, did you try to have like more complex generative models instead of those you propose? Like there are just dense layers, like for example with convolutional neural networks, variational autoencoders, GANs, or whatever. And do you think that they are useful in this case, or we should stick like to simpler models that you can train maybe in the loop, let's say, in the continual learning loop? And maybe we should stick to this very high level representation that is something that the brain does instead of trying to rearch from low representational layers.
So I'll be honest with you here. I did try that, as in my understanding was that we wanted to actively be able to use convolutional VAEs and similar approaches. Like we wanted to have a setup where we are able to directly use the convolutional layers and actually directly use feature map based rehearsals rather than going into the fully connected space. In fact, the motivation there was that if at all, like maybe we want to club that with things like attention modules and whatnot, and essentially have sort of identify features that are most relevant to the decision, sort of like what they do in learning without memorizing by Dhar et al. Very recently. The original idea was to be able to do that. It was just very difficult from the amount of computational resources we had and the amount of crowding that we had on our cluster, and that made it really difficult to go ahead and do it to that extent. But yes, it would be really nice if somebody did that as their future work. And I would personally, if I had the time and the ability to replicate these experiments, I would want to try that if I could. So yes, it would
Yeah.
be nice to do that. Obviously, the brain is by no means this simple. I mean, it's a lot more complex, and obviously there is a lot more involved. I mean, it would be very nice instead of using this FC512, if I could at least use the 3x3 con 512 and use it to a con VAE on both sides and use that. Maybe that would be something worthwhile to try. And
Yeah.
most people, to be honest, I mean, that would make for a really nice work, because we do not see a lot of that in continual learning research. About a lot of the generative replay based work or the pseudo rehearsal based work does not really focus too heavily on using convolutional generative models as much as they should. So that would have been nice to have.
Yeah, we are actually trying it with Gabriela, who is
It's
here actually
computationally not that
listening.
easy, but yeah.
It's very tough. We are working on this for many months, and I mean, it's not just computationally; it's also I mean, something that maybe as a community we are not ready to face yet in terms of quality of the algorithms. You know, because yeah, even if you don't consider, you know, the time that it needs a generative model to converge and should be like very fast, because we are doing that many times in, you know, during the continual learning stream. If you don't consider computational overheads, it's very complex algorithmically. It's not, we are not able to really generate high quality representations that are high dimensional, and that could last, you know, for a very long time, because in the end you're trying to generate them and relearn from them, learn from them. So you're keeping, you know, lowering the quality of these representations over time, and so after a while it becomes you know, not usable anymore. So that's the problem. So we have another question from I think Olpadkar. If you want, you can ask it.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
So my question is that the PFC and NCT models are like basically autoencoders, right? So are this class do we get the information of the are those class conditional autoencoders, like when you generate samples of 512 dimension for real, sir? So how do you know about like what class those samples belongs to? Because I don't think these are class conditional.
No, these are not class conditional, you're right. So like I said earlier, so essentially what we are doing is that when we try to encode the representation from the hippocampus 512 fully connected 512 into either of the autoencoders, we are doing it only in sort of batches. Essentially, like we are done with the base classes, we do it for you know, all of the base classes that we've seen together. We are done with base classes plus say 10 more increments of 2 classes each, so that is 50 plus 20, that is 70 classes. Then we do it for 70 classes. So that is the way we do it.
Okay, so like in that case, like for Rehearsal or that training, like what you use as label for that?
For which one?
So like once you have generated the samples for Rehearsal, then like you train using those, right? So what you use as like y term, that is like label or class label, because we don't know the class of the
No, so
sample.
we don't use the labels there. So essentially the way we do this kind of a pseudo rehearsal is that we understand the fact that we want to generate a certain kind of a fully connected representation, and as the fully connected representation should have looked when it was trained for, let's say, if the we are doing the first increment, then the fully connected representation should have been learned in a certain way to actually be competitive, to be a competitive classifier in the base class situation. So the idea is that if the parameters in the model that we'll finally be using for inference is good enough to learn a particular representation that is suitable for the good classification itself, then simply showing that representation should allow the parameters to have a snapshot of the learning that was attained while learning that representation. So instead of performing the, you know, sort of the incremental learning while we do have classifier objectives for the new classes, all that is fine. But when you are talking about sort of keeping the model parameters in line with what they were when they were suitable for learning the past representations, or being a good classifier for the past classes, it is sufficient to actually show them a representation that would have been a snapshot of one that had been learned while doing the earlier tasks. So we are treating this as a representation learning problem at the point of trying to preserve parameters as they would be suitable for classification in the past tasks. So we do not have to have the labels for all the classes that were seen in the past. because this is anyway not a multi-head evaluation system at every stage of the process.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions for Arijit? Julio, do you have any questions for Arijit?
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about, because I mean, I have the same question as Vincenzo, because I don't know if these two representations, the one that the PFC and the one that NCT, you get, they're that kind of different, and it should be great if you can know if they're. Let me start. It should be great if you know if those representations are learning different things, because I don't know if they are learning different things. I was thinking about why should they, in a machine learning perspective. I don't know the neuroscience perspective. So I don't know if
so eventually, eventually at the conclusion of the encoding process on both sides, they shouldn't be learning different things per se. The only difference is that every time, let's say at stage M, you have certain encoding that is learned for the NCT, and at that point something else is being written onto the PFC from the hippocampus, and then or the HC module there. And at the point of trying to encode from the PFC to the NCT, the parameters that were used to learn the previous representation seen in the NCT, that they are likely to get modified. So that modification is sort of controlled heavily using a very strong regularization, like at every layer, based on the decoder parameters there. So eventually, if at the end of, like, if you to look at, let's say all the 100 classes have been learned, you would ideally expect your PFC and NCT to have learned the same thing. It's in the intermediate process where the difference crops in, where the control or the restriction or the resistance to learning new things in the NCT is much stronger as compared to the PFC. So if you pick up the PFC and the NCT in one of these intermediate stages, you would see that the presentations learned are slightly different. But if you pick them up after all the 100 classes have been learned, they should ideally be the same.
I see. So in the long term, there it should be a difference to learn these two representations separately. But in the short term, you see the difference there.
Yeah, in the short term, as in like when the incremental learning process is going on, because there is a sort of a lag in the number of epochs before, or sorry, the number of incremental stages before you actually encode the state of the PFC into the NCT. So there is this, lag in the number of incremental stages anyway. So you definitely see a difference in what the PFC learns versus what the NCT learns, and this is over and above the, more resistant to change parameters in the NCT as compared to the PFC. So in the short term, yes, you will see differences. In the long term, when all the incremental classes have been seen and the process is concluded, they should be learning the same thing.
I see. Okay, thanks. I want to think about a little more, but I think that I get it now.
So
Thanks.
essentially, like in the paper, there is a supplementary material where we sort of discuss these things in a lot more detail, like why is it that we do things in this way, and if at all, and what are the criticism that we ourselves thought about, in terms of the biological basis that we talk about doing, and whether or not it is appropriate or not. So a lot of these things are discussed there. We also talk about this effect of, not immediately writing all the representation as they are learned, and having this gap in the number of incremental stages between the PFC and the NCT consolidation.
Great. I should look at that.
That's great. So we will definitely read the paper with more carefully. And I'd like to thank you again, Arijit, for your time. And I thank you all for being here today. Arijit, if you want, you can share your slides. Would be great with us through the Slack workspace. I don't know if you are into it, but you can share it there or on our forum that we have on continual learning that you can access through the official ContinualAI, website. And there is already a topic in which you can post your slides, maybe, and where we can continue this discussion in case. So thank you all again, and I'll see you next Friday for the next reading group session, which is gonna be, sorry, 1 second. I missed it here. Okay, the next reading group session next Friday at 5:30 CET time zone is going to be about energy-based models for continual learning. So thank you all again for joining, and I'll see you then.
Yeah, thanks everyone for hearing my presentation. I'm sorry about once again the issue with the time zones and
no problem
keeping you waiting. But yeah, thanks for turning up nevertheless.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you everyone. Thank you Vincenzo for inviting.
My pleasure.